My wife left for a trip with her friends, leaving me alone with our son, who had been paralyzed for 10 years. The moment she pulled out of the driveway, I heard a sound that defied all logic. My son was standing at the top of the stairs. I dropped my coffee. I reached for my phone to call for help, but he grabbed my wrist with a strength he was not supposed to have. "Dad, we need to get out of this house right now. Before I continue this story, please hit the like button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to protect your family from the very person who was supposed to love them." My name is Victor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, a man who has spent his entire life dealing in facts, physics, and load-bearing walls. I believe in things I can measure. I do not believe in miracles. But on a quiet Friday morning, everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my reality was torn to pieces. It was exactly 5 minutes past 8. My wife Valerie had just left our house for a weekend wine tasting trip in Napa Valley. She had kissed my cheek, told me not to worry about our son Preston, and driven off in her pristine white sedan. I stood in our large kitchen in the Chicago suburbs, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. For a decade, our house had operated on a strict, unyielding routine. 10 years ago, a horrific car crash left Preston paralyzed from the waist down. He was 18 then, right on the edge of leaving for college. Since that day, he had been bound to a wheelchair, his life confined to the ground floor of our home. Valerie had taken over his care completely. She was the martyr, the devoted mother who sacrificed everything. I was the provider, the man who worked himself to the bone to pay the endless medical bills, the specialists, the private treatments. I was pouring myself a second cup of black coffee, enjoying the rare silence of a house that usually felt like a hospital ward. Then I heard it. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy, unsteady footsteps coming from the second floor. My engineering mind immediately tried to rationalize the sound. Wood expanding in the morning heat. A loose shutter slamming in the wind. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too human, and it was moving toward the top of the main oak staircase. My hand began to tremble. I stepped out of the kitchen and looked up into the shadows of the second-floor hallway. A figure stepped into the morning light filtering through the high windows. It was Preston. He was standing. My 28-year-old son, who had not walked a single step in 10 years, was gripping the wooden banister. He was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving with every ragged breath. His legs were shaking violently, trembling under the massive effort of supporting his own weight. His knuckles were white against the wood. But he was upright. He was taking a step down, then another. The ceramic mug slipped from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of pieces, splashing hot coffee across my shoes and the expensive white rug Valerie loved so much. I did not feel the heat. I could not feel my own legs. I forgot how to breathe. The laws of physics, the grim medical diagnoses we had cried over the reality. I had lived every single day for a decade, vanished in the span of 3 seconds. "Preston." I whispered, my voice choking on a sob. "Preston." I scrambled toward the base of the stairs, tears instantly blurring my vision. My son. My boy was walking. It was a miracle. It was the absolute impossible happening right before my very eyes. I reached the bottom step, my hands outstretched, terrified he was going to fall and break his neck on the hard wood. "I have got you, son," I cried out, grabbing his waist to stabilize him. "Oh my God, Preston, how is this possible? I need to call an ambulance. I need to call your mother. She is not going to believe this." I fumbled in my pocket for my cell phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I had to call Valerie. I had to tell her to turn the car around immediately and come home. Before my thumb could press the dial button, a hand clamped down on my wrist. It was Preston. His grip was not weak. It was desperate. It was like a steel vise digging into my bones. I looked up into my son's eyes, expecting to see joy, tears of triumph, or sheer exhaustion. Instead, I saw sheer, unadulterated terror. "Dad." "Stop," he gasped, his voice a harsh, raspy whisper. "Do not call anyone." "Preston, you are standing." I sobbed, completely overwhelmed by the emotion. "You are walking. The doctors said you would never walk again." "Dad, listen to me," he interrupted, his voice dropping into a frantic, urgent tone that chilled my blood instantly. "You need to listen to me right now." She did not go to Napa. I froze. The phone slipped slightly in my sweaty palm. "What are you talking about?" "Mom did not go to Napa Valley," Preston said, leaning heavily against me, his entire body shuddering with the massive physical effort. "She is not on a girls' trip. She is in the city. Dad, we need to get out of this house right now. We have to leave before she realizes what I have done." I stared at him, my 70-year-old brain struggling to process the barrage of impossible information. My son was walking. My son was terrified of his own mother. None of this made any sense. "Preston." "You are not making sense," I pleaded, trying to guide him to the living room sofa. "Let us sit down. You are in shock. The exertion is messing with your head." "I am not in shock," he hissed, refusing to sit. His eyes darted toward the front door, panicked like a hunted animal listening for the hounds. "She is setting you up, Dad. I heard her on the phone last night when she thought I was asleep. She is meeting with her lawyers today. She is locking your bank accounts right now. And on Monday morning she is filing papers in court to have you declared mentally incompetent. She is going to throw you in a locked psychiatric ward, and she is taking absolutely everything." The silence in the house became deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. "A psychiatric ward," repeated the words, feeling alien and bitter in my mouth. "Valerie, your mother. Why would she do that? Why are you walking? What is happening to us? Dad, we do not have time for this." Preston begged, pulling on my shirt with desperate strength. "You have to believe me. She is going to lock you away forever, and if she does, I will never get out of this house alive. Please, get the keys to the truck." I wanted to tell him he was hallucinating. I wanted to tell him that Valerie, the woman I had loved and provided for, the woman who had supposedly sacrificed her life to care for him, would never do something so monstrous. I wanted to demand a logical explanation. I wanted the math, the proof, the solid facts. Then my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a harsh, sharp vibration. I slowly lowered my gaze to the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was an automated text message from my primary banking institution. The account held the bulk of my life savings, the money I had kept liquid to pay for Preston's incredibly expensive physical therapies after I sold my engineering firm. I read the message once. Then I read it again. "Urgent security alert. Your primary checking account access has been revoked due to suspicious activity. Please contact your branch administrator immediately." A cold, heavy dread settled deep in my stomach. The kind of dread that tells you the ground you are standing on is a lie. The kind of dread that confirms your absolute worst nightmare is not a dream, but a waking reality. I looked at the shattered coffee mug on the floor. The dark liquid was seeping into the wood, ruining the pristine surface Valerie was always so obsessed with keeping perfect. It was a metaphor for my entire life. I looked up at Preston, my paralyzed son standing on his own 2 feet, begging me to save us from my wife. My wife. The woman who was supposed to be sipping wine in California, but was instead systematically dismantling my life from downtown Chicago. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. The confusion, the denial, and the shock evaporated, replaced entirely by the cold, calculating mind of an engineer who has just realized the building is going to collapse and there is only one exit. "Grab my shoulder, son," I said, my voice completely steady, stripped of all emotion. "We are going to the garage. We are leaving right now." I wrapped my right arm tightly around Preston's trembling waist. He felt incredibly heavy, his pale legs shaking violently, from the terrifying physical strain of suddenly supporting his own body weight. We stumbled quickly and clumsily through the long, quiet hallway of our home. The house felt entirely different to me now. It was no longer my safe sanctuary. It was a meticulously crafted cage designed solely to hold us captive. Every expensive piece of imported furniture was paid for by the grand evil illusion of my only son's permanently broken spine. We slowly reached the heavy oak door now. Preston was breathing incredibly hard by the time we made it, his face terribly pale and completely covered in a thick layer of cold sweat. I quickly punched the security code into the electronic keypad with a trembling index finger. The heavy steel deadbolt clicked open with a sharp, echoing snap. We stepped cautiously together into the cool, dimly lit garage. The custom handicap-accessible van sat directly in the center of the smooth concrete floor. I had paid exactly $80,000 for that specific vehicle, fully outfitting it with a motorized ramp complex, hydraulic lifts, and hand controls. It was a massive steel monument to the sinister lie Valerie had successfully built around us for an entire decade. I hurriedly opened the heavy passenger side door and practically lifted my exhausted son inside. Preston collapsed heavily against the soft leather seat, his chest heaving rapidly with deep exhaustion. I immediately ran around to the driver's side, climbed up behind the steering wheel, and pushed the engine start button firmly. The engine cranked very loudly, whining in a violent protest, but it absolutely did not turn over. I pushed the glowing start button a second time. Nothing happened today. A dry, hollow sputtering sound suddenly echoed ominously in the quiet garage. My analytical engineering mind instantly categorized the strange mechanical sound. It was certainly not a simple dead battery. It was a complete and total ignition failure. I quickly jumped out of the leather driver's seat and popped the heavy metal hood. I grabbed a bright tactical flashlight from my cluttered workbench and shone the strong beam directly onto the main engine block. My breath caught sharply in my tight throat. The spark plugs were completely gone. The connection wires dangled uselessly against the cold metal engine components now. This was absolutely not a mechanical failure or an unfortunate coincidence. It was deliberate, calculated, and highly malicious sabotage. Valerie had intentionally disabled the heavy van right before she casually left the house. She knew perfectly well that Preston could not safely drive my normal vehicle, and she wanted to make absolutely sure I could not take him anywhere if I panicked and tried to run away. She had purposefully and cleverly trapped us inside our own home. A sudden violent surge of cold, pure fury completely washed over my entire body. I slammed the heavy metal hood shut quickly. The loud, deafening bang echoed through the confined space. I looked frantically across the garage at the far corner, where I kept my old Ford pickup truck. It was a classic model covered entirely under a thick canvas tarp, completely neglected for many long years, because Valerie absolutely hated the mere sight of it. I had not driven it a single mile since the terrible day of Preston's tragic accident. I ran over quickly and aggressively yanked the heavy tarp off, sending a massive choking cloud of thick dust directly into the stale air. The heavy doors were locked perfectly. The actual vehicle keys were locked securely inside the house, in a heavy metal safe box I definitively did not have the combination for. I absolutely did not have the time to strictly search the entire house. I urgently grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the hanging tool wall, wrapped my thick winter jacket tightly around my right fist, and violently smashed the driver's side window. Sharp glass shattered violently and explosively across the smooth concrete floor. I reached carefully inside, unlocked the door manually from the inside, and quickly swept the sharp, broken glass off the worn seat carefully. I waved frantically for my terrified son to come over. Preston dragged his heavy body painfully across the cold garage floor, fighting bitterly and aggressively for every single inch of forward movement, and climbed slowly and painfully up into the dirty cab. I slid smoothly into the cold driver's seat. Without the actual metal key, I had to completely hotwire the heavy vehicle. My aged hands moved purely on long, ingrained muscle memory, and decades of intense mechanical engineering experience. I forcefully ripped away the lower plastic steering column cover with my bare hands. I quickly located the necessary wiring. I found the main ignition switch wiring harness underneath the broken plastic. I forcefully pulled out the thick red battery wire, and the yellow starter wire stripped the protective plastic ends away aggressively with my own teeth and twisted the exposed copper strands securely together. The dusty dashboard lights immediately flickered magically to bright life. I found the final ignition wire and struck it firmly against the twisted copper base. Bright yellow sparks flew wildly, instantly illuminating the dark interior cab. The old engine coughed very loudly, sputtered twice in loud protest, and then suddenly roared to roaring loud life. I immediately threw the heavy truck into reverse gear and hit the automatic garage door opener, located securely on the dirty sun visor. The heavy wooden door began to rise incredibly slowly, agonizingly inching upward. It was absolutely moving far too slowly for our desperate, urgent escape. I violently slammed my heavy right boot down directly onto the metal gas pedal, and the massive truck shot backward instantly. The metal roof violently and loudly scraped the very bottom edge of the slowly moving wooden garage door. We aggressively hit the paved concrete driveway with a very loud, high-pitched squeal. A loud screech of black tires echoed. I aggressively slammed the heavy gear shifter back directly into forward drive. As I rapidly turned the heavy steering wheel, my intensely bright headlights quickly swept across the very quiet residential street. A massive, entirely black SUV was slowly and quietly creeping around our typically quiet cul-de-sac. It had absolutely no visible license plates. The extremely dark tinted windows were rolled up completely tight. It was definitely not a friendly neighbor happily heading to a morning job. It was a hired private patrol car. Valerie had actually paid a professional watcher. I killed the headlights, instantly plunging us into total darkness. I floored the accelerator, tearing down the quiet street in the opposite direction. We sped recklessly through the pristine, manicured neighborhoods of our upscale suburb. I navigated the familiar winding streets purely by memory. We drove in heavy silence for 2 hours, steering the old rattling truck toward the gritty outskirts of Chicago. I finally found a decaying neon-lit motel. I paid for a room in cash. I helped Preston inside. I locked the heavy deadbolt firmly. "Preston," I whispered into the suffocating silence. "How long have you walked?" Preston sat heavily on the edge of the sagging motel mattress. The flickering neon sign from the parking lot cast long, distorted shadows across his pale face. He looked down at his trembling hands, taking a deep, shuddering breath before he finally looked up at me. 5 years, Dad." He spoke the words so quietly, they almost vanished into the hum of the broken air conditioner. 5 years. The number hit my chest like a physical blow. 5 years. Half a decade. My mind instantly raced back to the very beginning of this 10-year nightmare. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, vividly remembering the humid August night a decade ago. It was the exact night before Preston was supposed to leave for his freshman year at Stanford University. Our house was filled with packed boxes and immense pride. Then came the horrific phone call, the squeal of tires, the shattered windshield, the devastating car crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord completely. I remembered pacing the sterile, cold hospital corridors. I remembered the heavy scent of antiseptic and the suffocating weight of sheer panic. Then Valerie emerged from the consultation room with the lead surgeon. Her face was an absolute mask of tragic composure. She walked straight into my arms, weeping softly, whispering the words that broke my heart into a million irreparable pieces. "The damage is permanent, Victor. His spine is irreparably damaged. He will never walk again." From that exact moment, our entire existence completely shifted. Valerie immediately transformed into the ultimate martyr. She completely took over every single aspect of his medical care. She insisted with absolute devotion that a normal physical rehabilitation center was simply not good enough for our boy. She aggressively researched and eventually brought in a highly exclusive, incredibly expensive private specialist named Dr. Aris Thorne. He promised cutting-edge, personalized treatments that the standard medical community supposedly could not provide. I believed her. I trusted her implicitly because she was my wife, and she played the role of the endlessly devoted self-sacrificing mother with absolute perfection. She quit her social clubs. She stayed home every single day. She hovered over his wheelchair like a protective hawk. And I did exactly what a father is supposed to do. I provided. I worked myself down to the absolute bone. When Dr. Thorne's exorbitant monthly invoices started draining our savings, I did not hesitate. I sold my majority shares in the commercial engineering firm I had spent 30 years building from the ground up. I cashed out my retirement accounts. I liquidated our secondary properties. I gladly traded every single ounce of my professional legacy just to keep my son comfortable, believing I was funding the best possible medical care in the country. Preston shifted on the cheap bedspread, pulling me sharply back to the dimly lit motel room. His breathing was still shallow, his muscles still twitching from the immense effort of our escape. 5 years ago, I started feeling a burning sensation in my left foot. He continued, his voice trembling with a mixture of long, suppressed anger and profound sorrow. At first it was just a faint tingle, like pins and needles. I was so excited, Dad. I thought it was a genuine miracle. I told Mom immediately. I told Dr. Thorne the very next morning when he came for my physical evaluation. I stared at him, my analytical brain desperately trying to connect the jagged pieces of this horrifying puzzle. If you regained feeling 5 years ago, why did you stay in that chair? Why did you never tell me? Preston let out a bitter, hollow laugh that lacked any real humor. I did try to tell you. Do you remember when I kept saying my legs were burning and you thought it was phantom nerve pain? Mom intercepted every conversation. But more than that, it was the medication. Every single time I showed any genuine physical progress, every time I could successfully wiggle a toe or flex a calf muscle, Dr. Thorne would schedule a special emergency consultation. He would close the bedroom door, whisper with Mom in the hallway, and then they would come back inside with a brand new treatment plan. My stomach violently churned. A new treatment plan. Yes, Preston said, his eyes welling with frustrated tears. Mom called them my special vitamins. She said Dr. Thorne had formulated a unique compound specifically designed to prevent painful muscle necrosis. She insisted I needed them to survive. She would bring me a small paper cup with 2 heavy capsules every single night. She would stand right over me and watch me swallow them. And within 20 minutes, the absolute nightmare would begin. He rubbed his face aggressively, trying to erase the terrifying memories. The medicine did not help me, Dad. It did the exact opposite. Whenever I took those specific vitamins, a heavy, crushing fog would completely take over my brain. I could not think clearly. I could not string 2 logical sentences together. I felt like I was floating underwater, completely disconnected from reality. But the worst part was what it did to my body. Any strength I had managed to build up in my legs would instantly vanish. My muscles would turn to absolute jelly. I would wake up the next morning entirely paralyzed all over again, trapped inside a heavy, useless body, entirely dependent on her for absolutely everything. I listened in absolute horrified silence. The memories flooded my mind. I remembered coming home from a grueling 14-hour workday, walking into his bedroom, and finding him staring blankly at the ceiling, drool pooling at the corner of his mouth. Valerie would gently wipe his face with a warm cloth, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes, whispering about how severe his condition was becoming. She told me it was the natural progression of his terrible neurological trauma. She told me I needed to work more, earn more, so Dr. Thorne could find a better solution. She lied to my face every single day. She looked me directly in the eyes and weaponized my love for my son to fund a monstrous, calculated deception. They kept adjusting the dosage. Preston continued, his voice growing stronger, fueled by righteous indignation. Whenever my mind started to clear, whenever I started asking too many questions or demanding a second opinion from a different doctor, the dose would mysteriously increase. I was a prisoner, Dad. My own mother was my cruel warden, and Dr. Thorne was her loyal executioner. They were deliberately destroying my central nervous system to keep me confined to that wheelchair. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to fully comprehend. She had drained my life savings to pay a corrupt doctor to actively poison our son. Why I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly old and fragile in the quiet room. Why would she do this to you? Preston did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly rolled up the sleeve of his shirt, revealing his pale forearm. Hidden perfectly beneath the fabric were dozens of dark puncture marks. They were not treating me. They were sedating me. Preston sat heavily on the edge of the sagging motel mattress. The flickering neon sign from the parking lot cast long, distorted shadows across his pale face. He looked down at his trembling hands, taking a deep, shuddering breath, before he finally looked up at me. 5 years, Dad. He spoke the words so quietly they almost vanished into the hum of the broken air conditioner. 5 years. The number hit my chest like a physical blow. 5 years. Half a decade. My mind instantly raced back to the very beginning of this 10-year nightmare. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, vividly remembering the humid August night a decade ago. It was the exact night before Preston was supposed to leave for his freshman year at Stanford University. Our house was filled with packed boxes and immense pride. Then came the horrific phone call, the squeal of tires, the shattered windshield, the devastating car crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord completely. I remembered pacing the sterile, cold hospital corridors. I remembered the heavy scent of antiseptic and the suffocating weight of sheer panic. Then Valerie emerged from the consultation room with the lead surgeon. Her face was an absolute mask of tragic composure. She walked straight into my arms, weeping softly, whispering the words that broke my heart into a million irreparable pieces. The damage is permanent, Victor. His spine is irreparably damaged. He will never walk again. From that exact moment, our entire existence completely shifted. Valerie immediately transformed into the ultimate martyr. She completely took over every single aspect of his medical care. She insisted with absolute devotion that a normal physical rehabilitation center was simply not good enough for our boy. She aggressively researched and eventually brought in a highly exclusive, incredibly expensive private specialist named Dr. Aris Thorne. He promised cutting-edge, personalized treatments that the standard medical community supposedly could not provide. I believed her. I trusted her implicitly because she was my wife, and she played the role of the endlessly devoted self-sacrificing mother with absolute perfection. She quit her social clubs. She stayed home every single day. She hovered over his wheelchair like a protective hawk. And I did exactly what a father is supposed to do. I provided. I worked myself down to the absolute bone. When Dr. Thorne's exorbitant monthly invoices started draining our savings, I did not hesitate. I sold my majority shares in the commercial engineering firm I had spent 30 years building from the ground up. I cashed out my retirement accounts. I liquidated our secondary properties. I gladly traded every single ounce of my professional legacy just to keep my son comfortable, believing I was funding the best possible medical care in the country. Preston shifted on the cheap bedspread, pulling me sharply back to the dimly lit motel room. His breathing was still shallow, his muscles still twitching from the immense effort of our escape. 5 years ago, I started feeling a burning sensation in my left foot, he continued, his voice trembling, with a mixture of long, suppressed anger and profound sorrow. At first it was just a faint tingle, like pins and needles. I was so excited, Dad. I thought it was a genuine miracle. I told Mom immediately. I told Dr. Thorne the very next morning when he came for my physical evaluation. I stared at him, my analytical brain desperately trying to connect the jagged pieces of this horrifying puzzle. If you regained feeling 5 years ago, why did you stay in that chair? Why did you never tell me? Preston let out a bitter, hollow laugh that lacked any real humor. I did try to tell you. Do you remember when I kept saying my legs were burning and you thought it was phantom nerve pain? Mom intercepted every conversation. But more than that, it was the medication. Every single time I showed any genuine physical progress, every time I could successfully wiggle a toe or flex a calf muscle, Dr. Thorne would schedule a special emergency consultation. He would close the bedroom door, whisper with Mom in the hallway, and then they would come back inside with a brand new treatment plan. My stomach violently churned. A new treatment plan. Yes, Preston said, his eyes welling with frustrated tears. Mom called them my special vitamins. She said Dr. Thorne had formulated a unique compound specifically designed to prevent painful muscle necrosis. She insisted I needed them to survive. She would bring me a small paper cup with 2 heavy capsules every single night. She would stand right over me and watch me swallow them. And within 20 minutes, the absolute nightmare would begin. He rubbed his face aggressively, trying to erase the terrifying memories. The medicine did not help me, Dad. It did the exact opposite. Whenever I took those specific vitamins, a heavy, crushing fog would completely take over my brain. I could not think clearly. I could not string 2 logical sentences together. I felt like I was floating underwater, completely disconnected from reality. But the worst part was what it did to my body. Any strength I had managed to build up in my legs would instantly vanish. My muscles would turn to absolute jelly. I would wake up the next morning entirely paralyzed all over again, trapped inside a heavy, useless body, entirely dependent on her for absolutely everything. I listened in absolute horrified silence. The memories flooded my mind. I remembered coming home from a grueling 14-hour workday, walking into his bedroom, and finding him staring blankly at the ceiling, drool pooling at the corner of his mouth. Valerie would gently wipe his face with a warm cloth, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes, whispering about how severe his condition was becoming. She told me it was the natural progression of his terrible neurological trauma. She told me I needed to work more, earn more, so Dr. Thorne could find a better solution. She lied to my face every single day. She looked me directly in the eyes and weaponized my love for my son to fund a monstrous, calculated deception. They kept adjusting the dosage, Preston continued, his voice growing stronger, fueled by righteous indignation. Whenever my mind started to clear, whenever I started asking too many questions or demanding a second opinion from a different doctor, the dose would mysteriously increase. I was a prisoner, Dad. My mother was my cruel warden, and Dr. Thorne was her loyal executioner. They were deliberately destroying my central nervous system to keep me confined to that wheelchair. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to fully comprehend. She had drained my life savings to pay a corrupt doctor to actively poison our son. Why, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly old and fragile in the quiet room. Why would she do this to you? Preston did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly rolled up the sleeve of his shirt, revealing his pale forearm. Hidden perfectly beneath the fabric were dozens of dark puncture marks. They were not treating me. They were sedating me. I stared at the bruised, punctured skin on my son's forearm. Those dark, clustered marks were a brutal map of a decade of systematic abuse. My stomach twisted with a sickening mixture of profound guilt and absolute rage. For 10 long years, I had dutifully paid the astronomical medical bills, blindly trusting the woman I married to care for the boy we brought into this world. I had surrendered my role as a protector because she convinced me I was only needed as a financial provider. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled Preston's soft cotton sleeve back down carefully, covering the horrific physical evidence of his long captivity. The overwhelming emotional shock threatened to paralyze my logical thought process, but I refused to let it. I am a structural engineer by trade. My entire professional life has been dedicated to understanding exactly how immense pressure affects complex foundations, identifying catastrophic stress fractures long before a massive building completely collapses. My own family was rapidly collapsing right now, and the foundation was built entirely on deliberate, highly malicious lies. I wiped my face with both hands, taking a deep, steadying breath to calm my heart. I needed to shift my active mind from a grieving father to a cold, calculating forensic analyst. I stood up from the sagging motel bed and walked over to the scratched veneer desk sitting in the dim corner of the room. I unzipped my worn leather satchel and pulled out my heavy silver laptop. I flipped it open, the bright digital screen illuminating the dark, dusty walls of our temporary hideout. Preston watched me silently from the edge of the bed, his rapid breathing finally beginning to steady after the physical exertion of our frantic escape. Valerie thought she had completely cornered me by revoking my digital access to our primary checking and savings accounts. She falsely believed that cutting off my immediate cash flow would leave me terrified, confused, and entirely compliant to her wicked demands. But she had gravely underestimated the meticulous nature of my personal financial planning. During the peak profitable years of my commercial engineering firm, I had quietly established several secondary tax shelter accounts and a secure private corporate trust that she knew absolutely nothing about. These hidden accounts were fortified with complex, separate authentication protocols and routed through a completely independent financial institution. My stiff fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard, accurately typing in the complex passphrases and long security keys I had perfectly memorized decades ago. Within 3 intense minutes, I had successfully bypassed her digital blockade. I now had full, unrestricted access to the master ledger of our shared credit lines and historical banking data. I immediately pulled up the real-time transaction history for the premium platinum credit card Valerie always kept safely tucked inside her designer purse. She had explicitly told me she was driving up the scenic coast to Napa Valley for a deeply relaxing weekend of wine tasting with her closest girlfriends. I naturally expected to see routine gas station charges in Nevada or hotel deposits somewhere in Northern California. Instead, the glowing digital ledger painted a vastly different, deeply disturbing picture of her actual movements. Her credit card had not been swiped anywhere near a sunny California vineyard today. Exactly 30 minutes after she had kissed my cheek and cheerfully driven away from our suburban home, a massive pending charge had been officially authorized at a 5-star luxury hotel located directly in the heart of downtown Chicago. She had never even left the city limits. I scrolled further down the bright screen, my tight jaw clenching harder with every single line item. Following the exorbitant hotel deposit, there was a rapid string of massive purchases at high-end fashion boutiques along the famous Magnificent Mile. She had casually spent $12,000 at a luxury jeweler and another $8,000 at an exclusive designer clothing retailer, all within a brief span of just 4 hours. She was not on a girls' trip. She was actively celebrating. She was recklessly spending my hard-earned money on an extravagant shopping spree while setting the final legal stage to have me permanently locked inside a sterile psychiatric facility. I stared blankly into the glowing screen, letting the sheer magnitude of her brilliant deception fully settle into my tired mind. The horrifying truth acted exactly like a bright, piercing spotlight, suddenly illuminating the dark, highly questionable corners of the past 10 years. I began to actively look back at the entire preceding decade with a newfound, absolutely terrifying clarity. I specifically thought about the early chaotic days immediately following Preston's tragic car accident. I had aggressively hired the absolute best private rehabilitation nurses my considerable money could possibly buy. I desperately wanted an entire dedicated team of highly trained medical professionals residing in our home to ensure his maximum comfort and his highest potential for physical recovery. But one by one, Valerie had systematically and ruthlessly fired every single one of them. She loudly claimed the first nurse was criminally negligent. She angrily accused the second of stealing expensive items from her personal jewelry box. She convincingly said the third made Preston feel deeply uncomfortable in his own bedroom. Within a single year, she had completely isolated him from the entire outside medical community, perfectly ensuring she was the only person who strictly monitored his daily routine. And she had methodically isolated me as well. Whenever I tried to read his detailed medical charts, or whenever I strongly suggested sitting in on his private therapy sessions with Dr. Aris Thorne, she would gently place her soft hand on my chest and sadly shake her head. "You are getting older, Victor," she would softly say, using that incredibly patronizing tone she had perfected over the long years. "Your blood pressure is already far too high from constantly managing the engineering firm. You provide the vital financial support, and I will happily manage the medical stress. Leave the heavy lifting entirely to me." It was brilliant. It was a terrifying masterclass in targeted psychological manipulation. She had successfully weaponized my advancing age, my demanding career, and my deep, unconditional love for my family to systematically blindfold me. I leaned much closer to the bright laptop screen, my tired eyes narrowing sharply as I initiated a deep, comprehensive dive into the archival transaction records spanning the last 36 months. I was desperately looking for the exact financial footprint of her wicked partnership with Dr. Thorne. I quickly scrolled past the routine household expenses, the regular utility bills, and the expensive weekly grocery deliveries. Then I finally saw it. It was buried extremely deep within the automated monthly bank transfers, disguised expertly as a recurring corporate property investment. On the 15th of every single month for the past 5 consecutive years, exactly $25,000 was being quietly funneled from our joint investment portfolio directly into a private limited liability holding company. I slowly highlighted the small digital text, my beating heart turning completely to solid ice as I read the registered corporate name aloud into the silent motel room. Thorne and V Real Estate. Thorne and V Real Estate. The name of the holding company echoed in my mind like a death knell. I gently closed my laptop, moving quietly so as not to disturb Preston. He had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on the neighboring bed, his chest rising and falling with a peaceful rhythm I had not seen in a decade. I draped a spare blanket over his legs, ensuring the deadbolt was firmly locked from the inside, and stepped out into the frigid night air. I needed a secure public network. I drove my old Ford down the desolate highway until the glowing neon sign of a 24-hour diner pierced the darkness. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in. I slid into a sticky vinyl booth in the far corner, ordering a black coffee I had no intention of drinking. I opened my laptop, connecting to the unencrypted network, shielding the screen from the tired waitress wiping down the counter. My engineering background had taught me how to trace structural faults down to the micromillimeter, and financial fraud was essentially the exact same discipline. You simply follow the stress fractures until you find the broken beam. I started with the man who had been prescribing my son a daily dose of poison. I typed Dr. Aris Thorne into the State Medical Board database. The initial search yielded a perfectly curated professional profile, complete with glowing reviews and prestigious affiliations. But I knew exactly how to dig deeper. I ran his credentials through a federal registry, cross-referencing his past addresses. That is when the pristine facade began to crumble. 8 years before Valerie brought him into our home, Thorne had his medical license quietly suspended in the state of Florida. The official disciplinary records were buried under layers of dense legal jargon, but the core offense was crystal clear. He had been investigated for severe medical malpractice, specifically relating to the gross overprescription of powerful sedatives and highly experimental chemical compounds to extremely vulnerable patients. He had narrowly avoided going to federal prison by voluntarily surrendering his state medical license and quietly moving away. Valerie had not found a miracle worker. She had deliberately sought out a disgraced, desperate man with a documented history of severe medical abuse. I pulled up the public property tax records for the greater Chicago area, actively searching for the holding company I had just found on my wife's shared credit card statement. Thorn and V Real Estate. The search results loaded instantly, and my tight jaw clenched so hard my back teeth actually ached. This disgraced, completely unlicensed practitioner currently owned 3 ultra-luxury residential penthouses right in the wealthy center of the city. The combined market value was easily over $6 million. A private rehabilitation doctor dealing with a single paralyzed patient could never legitimately afford a massive real estate portfolio of that magnitude. He was not earning a regular salary. He was continuously receiving a massive cut of a much larger, highly coordinated criminal enterprise. But where exactly was the initial massive capital coming from? My personal engineering wealth was substantial, but I had tightly controlled the outward flow of my liquid cash. They were somehow getting millions of dollars from somewhere else entirely. The devastating realization suddenly hit me with the overwhelming physical force of a speeding freight train. My late brother, Thomas. Before Thomas tragically passed away from aggressive pancreatic cancer 7 years ago, he had legally established a massive, irrevocable medical trust fund entirely dedicated to his beloved nephew. The private trust was initially seeded with exactly $8 million explicitly legally designated to cover Preston's lifelong medical care, highly specialized mobility equipment, and potential future reconstructive surgeries. Because of my constantly grueling work schedule at the busy engineering firm, and because I implicitly trusted the woman I had married, I had willingly signed over the primary administrative rights of that trust to Valerie. She was the legally designated custodial caregiver. She had absolute, completely unchecked authority over exactly how those extensive funds were dispersed, as long as the ongoing expenses were strictly categorized as necessary medical treatments. I securely logged into the private wealth management portal using a secret administrative bypass code I had carefully set up when Thomas first drafted the dense legal documents. I rapidly navigated directly to the main trust ledger. My trembling hands hovered uncertainly over the glowing keyboard. I took a very sharp, deep breath and pressed enter. The digital screen instantly populated with 10 full years of detailed financial history. I stared blankly at the digital numbers, feeling a sudden wave of profound, sickening nausea wash completely over my entire body. It was an absolute financial massacre. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been methodically and ruthlessly bled out month after month, year after agonizing year. The outgoing wire transfers were all personally authorized by Valerie and paid directly to various obscure shell companies completely owned by Dr. Eris Thorne. The expense categories were creatively diverse and completely entirely fabricated. Advanced experimental neurological stimulation therapy, highly specialized spinal cord cellular regeneration protocols, advanced custom mobility equipment procurement. It was an incredibly sophisticated, perfectly documented paper trail of absolute, unadulterated lies. Every single dollar intended to give my son a better, more comfortable life had been actively used to continuously pay a corrupt, evil monster to keep him chemically paralyzed in a rusted wheelchair. They were literally heavily billing the massive trust fund to continuously and systematically poison the sole beneficiary. I scrolled frantically to the very bottom of the complex digital ledger to check the current available financial balance. The glowing red numbers confirmed my absolute worst fear. The $8 million safety net my brother had lovingly built for his nephew was completely gone. There was barely $30,000 left in the account. Valerie and Thorne had ruthlessly drained the entire family fortune. But the final, most terrifying puzzle piece was still missing. If the trust fund was completely depleted, why was Valerie taking such an extreme, highly dangerous legal risk right now? Why was she orchestrating an elaborate legal scheme to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me inside a psychiatric ward this coming Monday? I looked at the date on the screen, then looked at the total calculated value of my own personal remaining assets. My private investment portfolios, my commercial real estate holdings, and the equity in our marital home currently totaled roughly $4 million. As long as I was legally classified as competent, she could not touch a single penny of that remaining vast wealth. My large estate was heavily protected by strict legal safeguards that required my direct physical signature for any massive asset liquidation. I suddenly understood the true, terrifying, absolute scope of her immediate timeline. She had completely exhausted Preston's trust fund. The golden goose was entirely dead. Her lavish luxury lifestyle, her expensive downtown hotel, stays her designer shopping sprees, and Thorne's vast luxury real estate empire were suddenly completely out of money. She desperately needed a brand new source of massive funding, and she needed it immediately. I was the next target. I was the next target. The sheer chilling magnitude of her sociopathic greed finally settled deep into my weary bones. My immediate primal instinct was to grab my mobile phone and dial the local authorities to scream the horrifying truth to absolutely anyone who would listen to me. But my highly trained analytical mind quickly and forcefully overrode that incredibly dangerous emotional impulse. If I walked straight into a bustling police precinct at 70 years old, frantically ranting about a grand 10-year conspiracy involving a highly respected medical specialist, a deliberately faked physical paralysis, and a massive hidden real estate empire, I would sound exactly like a man rapidly losing his entire mind. I would be playing perfectly and directly into her carefully manicured hands. She already had the completely forged medical evaluation declaring me legally insane. She was actively and meticulously building an airtight legal case to completely seize my remaining estate through a forced legal conservatorship. A hysterical, totally unsubstantiated police report would simply be the final necessary nail in my own coffin. I desperately needed hard, irrefutable physical proof. I needed the actual physical poison she was actively using to keep my only son compliant. I slowly looked over at the opposite side of the dimly lit room. Preston was sleeping very deeply, his chest rising and falling in the quiet, dusty shadows of the cheap motel. I quietly wrote down a long list of strict specific instructions on a piece of thin motel stationery, leaving it directly beside a cheap, prepaid burner phone I had purchased earlier at a desolate gas station. I securely locked the heavy metal deadbolt from the outside and stepped quickly into the freezing, bitter Chicago night. I drove my old rattling Ford pickup truck back toward our pristine, highly affluent suburb, my racing mind entirely focused on the highly critical task directly ahead of me. The winding residential streets were entirely empty at exactly 2 a.m, bathed softly in the artificial pale yellow glow of the towering streetlights. I parked the heavy truck exactly 3 blocks away from my own massive property, absolutely not wanting to accidentally trigger the sensitive motion. Activated security cameras securely mounted directly above our wide paved driveway. I walked silently and carefully through the damp, cold grass of the neighboring manicured yards, approaching my own enormous home exactly like a common, desperate thief in the dead of the dark night. The towering custom-built brick structure looked deeply sinister and incredibly imposing in the dark. I successfully bypassed the main exterior alarm system by carefully accessing the secondary utility box, hidden perfectly behind the dense, overgrown rhododendron bushes near the side gate. I had personally designed and installed the entire complex security grid exactly 5 years ago, meaning I knew exactly how to temporarily blind the sensitive exterior laser sensors without accidentally sending a silent panic signal directly to the private monitoring company. I slipped quietly and effortlessly through the heavy glass patio door, stepping silently into the cavernous, utterly silent kitchen. The massive house felt incredibly cold, distinctly hostile, and completely empty. I navigated the dark, deeply familiar hallways purely by long, ingrained physical memory. I knew exactly which expensive imported oak floorboards naturally squeaked and which ones were structurally completely silent. I moved forward with agonizing, deliberate slowness, my tight heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm directly against my aching ribs, until I finally reached the heavy, solid mahogany door of Valerie's private home office. She always kept it completely locked. I pulled a thin steel tension wrench and a small, delicate picking hook directly from my thick jacket pocket tools, I often used for precisely calibrating highly delicate commercial engineering instruments. Within 40 intense seconds, the heavy brass lock clicked open loudly. I slipped quickly inside the dark room and quietly closed the heavy wooden door firmly behind me, immediately turning on my small, bright tactical flashlight. The intensely focused beam rapidly swept across her pristine, meticulously organized glass desk. I knew deeply in my gut that she was purposefully hiding the actual highly potent medication somewhere inside this specific room. I methodically and quietly checked every single wooden drawer, every locked filing cabinet, and every decorative wooden box resting on the wide shelves. Nothing. I stood perfectly still in the exact center of the dark room, actively thinking exactly like a seasoned structural engineer. I carefully studied the primary load-bearing walls, desperately looking for any slight spatial discrepancies or architectural anomalies. My tired eyes quickly landed directly on a massive, heavy oil painting, hanging exactly perfectly centered on the far empty wall. I carefully lifted the heavy, ornate wooden frame completely off its thick brass hooks and gently set it down on the soft carpet. A smooth, flush-mounted heavy steel wall safe stared silently back at me. It was an older, highly reliable mechanical combination model. I absolutely did not have the secret access code, but my lifelong profession requires an incredibly acute, highly sensitive understanding of internal physical acoustics and heavy metal friction. I quickly retrieved a standard high-quality medical stethoscope directly from my worn leather satchel, a simple diagnostic tool I had deliberately bought from an all-night pharmacy on my long drive here. I placed the cold, flat acoustic chest piece directly against the heavy solid steel door, resting it precisely next to the rotating, brass combination dial. I pressed the soft rubber earpieces tightly and deeply into my ears, closed my tired eyes completely, and began to turn the heavy metal dial incredibly agonizingly slowly. I listened intently and desperately for the faint, distinct mechanical clicks of the heavy internal metal tumblers falling perfectly into their designated machined slots. It required absolute agonizing patience and supreme unwavering physical focus. Click. That was the first hidden number. I immediately reversed the extremely slow rotation, listening incredibly closely to the delicate, abrasive scrape of solid brass against cold steel. Click. The second heavy tumbler dropped perfectly into its resting place. I rotated the heavy dial one final deliberate time entirely to the right side. A very loud, incredibly heavy clunk echoed sharply and clearly directly through the sensitive medical stethoscope. I quickly grabbed the sturdy solid steel handle and pulled down extremely firmly. The incredibly heavy safe door swung open immediately with a very soft, highly satisfying mechanical sigh. I shone the bright flashlight beam directly into the dark interior. There were exactly 4 unmarked transparent plastic medication bottles sitting inside. The original pharmaceutical labels were completely peeled off. Suddenly, the loud, unmistakable sound of the heavy front door unlocking instantly echoed through the silent house. My heart hammered a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribcage. The heavy front door had just echoed shut, and heavy footsteps were already moving rapidly across the imported hardwood floors of the main foyer. They were not the light, measured clicks of Valerie's designer heels. These footsteps were heavy, urgent, and distinctly male. I had mere seconds to react before he entered the room. I lunged forward desperately, grabbing the 4 unmarked plastic medication bottles from the open steel safe. I shoved them deep into the inner pockets of my heavy winter jacket. I frantically swept my hand across the smooth glass desk, grabbing the thick manila folder containing the forged psychiatric evaluations I had located moments before. I needed an immediate, secure hiding place. The expansive home office offered incredibly few viable options for a man of my size. My eyes darted to the tall, louvered mahogany doors of the walk-in storage closet, tucked tightly into the far, dark corner of the room. I bolted across the soft Persian carpet, throwing my heavy body directly into the narrow, suffocating darkness of the small closet, just as the brass handle of the main office door began to slowly turn. I pulled the louvered door shut securely, leaving a microscopic fraction of an inch slightly open so I could carefully peer out into the room. I held my breath, entirely pressing my back perfectly flat against the cold plaster wall. The heavy office door swung open abruptly with a forceful, aggressive push. The bright, sterile overhead lights flared brilliantly to life, momentarily blinding my sensitive eyes through the narrow wooden slats. As my blurred vision quickly adjusted to the sudden brightness, I recognized the nocturnal intruder immediately. It was not my treacherous wife. It was Dr. Eris Thorne. He looked absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogantly calm medical professional who usually glided smoothly into our quiet home with his expensive leather medical bag. Tonight, his incredibly expensive tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled and stained. His silk tie was pulled forcefully loose around his thick neck, and a thick, highly visible sheen of nervous sweat coated his pale, glistening forehead. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his dark eyes darting frantically and desperately around the pristine, meticulously organized office space. He marched aggressively and directly toward the massive glass desk, completely ignoring the open wall safe in his blind, absolute panic. He immediately began tearing through the neat, orderly stacks of household paperwork, violently tossing expensive, personalized stationery and thick leather-bound financial ledgers directly onto the floor. I watched him closely from my dark sanctuary, calculating his every erratic movement. He was desperately searching for the exact folder I held. He cursed loudly, a sharp, highly venomous sound that completely shattered the quiet dignity of my beloved home. He slammed his heavy fist directly against the pristine glass desktop, pacing nervously like a trapped, panicked animal. After a long moment of frantic, completely fruitless searching, he rapidly reached directly into his dark trousers, pulled out his mobile phone, and aggressively tapped the glowing digital screen. He forcefully hit the speakerphone button and tossed the sleek device roughly onto the cluttered desk. The loud, incredibly rhythmic ringing filled the intensely tense air of the room. Valerie answered abruptly on the second ring. Her familiar voice was sharp, highly annoyed, and completely lacking her usual melodic, soothing charm. "Aris, what exactly is taking you so long?" she demanded impatiently. "Did you finally get the specific documents from the desk?" Dr. Thorne leaned heavily over the glowing mobile phone right now, very angrily. His pale face was an absolute mask of furious, unadulterated anxiety. "I am aggressively looking right now, Valerie. The crucial files are absolutely not sitting where you explicitly promised they would be. I desperately need those perfectly forged psychiatric evaluations directly in my hands tonight. You confidently assured me they were completely finalized and sitting right here on the center of the glass desk." Valerie sighed incredibly loudly through the small, crackling digital speaker. "They are exactly there, Aris. Stop acting completely hysterical, stop panicking like a child, and look properly. I left them positioned perfectly right next to the lamp. We absolutely cannot afford any stupid mistakes at this highly critical stage." "I am definitively not panicking." Thorne hissed viciously, aggressively swiping a large pile of thick envelopes directly onto the floor. "I am desperately trying to securely finalize our massive life-altering investment. If I do not physically have those highly specific legal papers safely in my briefcase by tomorrow morning, our entire meticulously planned timeline completely shifts. We absolutely need to formally submit them to the court immediately. By Monday noon, the judge will quickly grant the specific medical conservatorship. As soon as that wooden gavel drops, Victor is completely legally erased from existence. The local police will drag him kicking and screaming directly to the secure, locked psychiatric ward, and we will finally have complete, entirely uncontested access to the absolute remainder of his $4 million estate." My blood ran absolutely terrifyingly cold. Hearing the highly vicious, perfectly calculated plan spoken completely aloud directly in my own home was a profound, deeply horrifying psychological violation. They had actively planned my total, absolute destruction with the completely casual, perfectly mundane tone of discussing a weekly grocery list. I forcefully tightened my stiff grip on the thick manila folder, the absolute physical proof of their impending malicious crime, safely hidden deep in the dark shadows directly with me. I closed my tired eyes for a second, silently steadying my breathing. The horrific, highly incriminating conversation was unfortunately far from completely over. Valerie's voice suddenly turned incredibly cold, entirely devoid of any human empathy, and deeply clinical. Once Victor is permanently safely locked away, we absolutely have to systematically deal with the boy immediately, she said firmly. Preston has definitively been moving far too much lately. He actively complained to me this morning about his dead legs burning. He is rapidly building a physical tolerance to the current chemical mixture. Thorne groaned loudly, running a stressed, shaking hand through his thinning, dark hair. I absolutely know, Valerie. I definitively noticed the severe muscle spasms during my last physical evaluation. The specific nerve blocks are absolutely starting to completely fail. We can finally up the heavy dosage on the kid once his interfering father is out of the picture. We will double the potent chemical compound in his evening pills. It will completely fry his motor functions entirely within 48 hours. He will definitively be a completely compliant vegetable, and we will not have to worry about him trying to stand up again. Okay, Valerie said. Just get the papers and get completely out of the house. Meet me back at the hotel suite. Thorne abruptly ended the call. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes actively scanning the quiet room. Then, his intense gaze landed directly on the louvered mahogany doors of the storage closet. My tight heart absolutely stopped. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. I silently reached out quickly in the dark. My fingers closed tightly around a heavy metal paperweight ready to strike. The heavy brass handle of the louvered closet door rattled loudly as Dr. Aris Thorne gripped it with his sweaty palm. My knuckles turned completely white around the heavy metal paperweight. My muscles tensed like tightly coiled springs preparing for a violent, desperate physical confrontation. I held my breath, pushing myself back into the suffocating darkness. I was prepared to swing the solid metal directly into his skull the absolute second the door opened. Just as the hinges began to creak, a sharp ringtone suddenly shattered the tension. Thorne violently flinched, snatching his hand away from the closet door. He leaped across the carpet, frantically grabbing his glowing mobile phone from the cluttered glass desk. It was Valerie calling him back. Her voice now, a frantic shriek, vibrating through the small speaker. "Get out of there right now!" she screamed. The private security company just called to report a brief power fluctuation on the main exterior sensors. If Victor triggered an alarm, the local police are already on their way. Grab whatever medical files you can find and leave immediately. Thorne panicked entirely. He shoved the phone into his jacket, completely abandoning his search for the specific forged documents that I currently held tightly against my chest. He frantically scooped up a random stack of irrelevant billing invoices from the floor, shoved them clumsily into his expensive leather briefcase, and sprinted out of the home office. I listened to his heavy footsteps pounding loudly down the long hallway. A few seconds later, the massive front door slammed shut with a reverberating thud, followed quickly by the aggressive screech of expensive tires tearing out of our driveway. I let out a ragged exhale, my entire body shaking violently from the massive adrenaline dump. I waited 3 agonizing minutes in the absolute darkness of the closet to ensure the house was genuinely empty. I pushed the louvered doors open and stepped cautiously back into the bright office. I tucked the heavy manila folder containing the forged psychiatric evaluations and the 4 unmarked pill bottles securely into my thick winter jacket. I moved silently through the silent house, slipping out the back patio door and vanishing perfectly into the cold shadows of the sleeping neighborhood. When I reached my old Ford pickup truck, I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the heavy doors. I did not drive back to the decaying motel right away. I had an extremely urgent destination in mind. My analytical engineer brain was now operating at maximum capacity. I needed undeniable scientific proof of exactly what chemical poison they were forcing down my son's throat every single night. I aggressively navigated the empty expressways, driving straight toward a highly discreet, 24-hour private testing laboratory located on the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. The facility was quietly owned by Julian Hayes, an old brilliant chemical engineer and a deeply trusted retired colleague. I had personally helped Julian secure the structural permits for this exact facility over a decade ago. I knew he kept nocturnal hours, preferring the absolute quiet of the deep night for his complex analysis. I pulled into the desolate parking lot and banged my heavy fist directly against the reinforced steel security door. Julian answered after a long minute. He wore a stained white lab coat, his thick glasses pushed high up on his wrinkled forehead. "Victor," he asked, his tired eyes widening in unadulterated surprise. "What on earth are you doing here at this ungodly hour?" I pushed past him, stepping into the bright laboratory. "I absolutely do not have time for pleasantries, Julian. I need your professional expertise, and I need this completely off the official books." I reached deeply into my thick jacket and placed the 4 unmarked plastic pill bottles directly onto his stainless steel examination table. Julian stared at the mysterious capsules, his professional curiosity instantly piqued. "What exactly are these, Victor?" I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills directly from my worn leather satchel. It was exactly $5,000 in cold cash, funds I had deliberately withdrawn during my initial escape. I pushed the heavy stack of money across the cold metal table. "I do not know what they are, Julian, but I suspect they are highly toxic, unregulated neurotoxins. I need a comprehensive, expedited chemical analysis. I need to know exactly what complex chemical compounds are inside these specific capsules, and I need the detailed toxicology report in my hands within the next 24 hours. No legal questions asked." Julian looked down at the massive pile of cash, then looked directly into my desperate, burning eyes. He slowly nodded his head, sliding the unmarked bottles and the money toward his side of the table. "I will run the mass spectrometer immediately, Victor. You will have your definitive answers by tomorrow morning." I thanked him quickly and walked back out into the freezing Chicago wind. I checked the glowing digital clock on my dashboard. It was exactly 5 in the morning. The dark sky was just beginning to turn a bruised shade of purple. I only had one final, critically important stop to make before I could return to my terrified son. I threw the heavy truck into gear and drove aggressively toward the highly affluent gated communities of the North Shore. I was heading directly to the private residence of Richard Sterling. Richard was not just my primary corporate attorney. He was an incredibly ruthless, fiercely loyal legal shark who had viciously protected my commercial engineering firm from predatory corporate lawsuits for over 20 long years. He was the only man I implicitly trusted to navigate the impending legal massacre. I parked my rattling truck recklessly in his pristine driveway and marched directly up the wide, elegant stone steps. I banged my heavy right fist violently and aggressively against the heavy oak front door. I did not care if I woke up his entire sleeping neighborhood. I pounded on the solid wood until my knuckles throbbed with a persistent pain. After 3 agonizing minutes, the heavy door finally jerked open. Richard stood there in a silk bathrobe, his gray hair completely disheveled, his face flushed with righteous sleep-deprived fury. "Victor, are you completely insane?" he hissed angrily, tightening the belt of his robe. "Do you have any earthly idea what time it is?" I pushed my way past his imposing frame and walked directly into his grand, marble-floored foyer. "We do not have time to sleep, Richard," I said firmly, walking with absolute purpose straight into his formal dining room. I violently emptied my heavy leather satchel directly onto the polished mahogany dining table. The forged psychiatric evaluations and the printed financial documents detailing the depleted trust fund scattered perfectly into the bright overhead light. Richard stepped closer to the long table, his sharp legal mind instantly recognizing the devastating implications of the heavy paperwork. "What exactly is all this, Victor?" he whispered, completely stunned. I looked my old friend directly in the eyes. "Richard, have exactly 48 hours before my wife legally strips my mind my freedom and murders my son. We are going to war." Richard stood frozen in his marble foyer, his sleep-deprived eyes completely locked onto the chaotic pile of papers scattered across the mahogany table. He slowly reached out and picked up the forged psychiatric evaluation bearing Dr. Aris Thorne's signature. I watched his sharp, predatory legal mind instantly shift from profound confusion to absolute calculating fury. He gently set the evaluation down and picked up the financial ledger detailing the entirely depleted $8 million trust fund. Richard finally looked up at me, the color completely drained from his usually vibrant face. "Victor, this is a meticulously constructed legal guillotine," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a mixture of professional awe and deep personal disgust. "She has perfectly documented a completely false narrative of severe dementia and escalating paranoia. If Valerie physically walks into the probate courthouse on Monday morning and successfully files this specific petition first, you are completely dead in the water." He began pacing the polished floor, his bare feet slapping softly against the cold marble. "The brutal reality of current conservatorship laws is incredibly unforgiving, Victor. Once a judge officially stamps this emergency medical order, you instantly lose absolutely every single fundamental human right. You will not be allowed to hire your own attorney. You will not be allowed to access your own bank accounts. You will not even be allowed to legally protest your own forced institutionalization. The local police will simply arrive at your door, place you in heavy restraints, and transport you directly to a locked psychiatric ward. And the absolute worst part is that she will instantly gain complete unfettered legal control over your $4 million estate and ultimate medical authority over Preston. We have less than 48 hours before the county clerk opens their doors. We cannot afford to simply play defense. If we wait for her to file, we will be trapped in a suffocating legal nightmare for years, and Preston will absolutely not survive that timeline." I stood perfectly still, letting his chilling legal assessment wash completely over me. "What exactly is our countermove, Richard?" I asked, my voice remaining incredibly steady, despite the raging storm of pure panic building deep inside my chest. Richard stopped pacing and slammed his heavy hands down onto the thick table. "We absolutely must ambush her," he stated fiercely, his eyes burning with absolute unwavering resolve. "We are going to completely dismantle her entire operation before she even steps foot near the courthouse steps." He immediately marched into his adjacent home office, completely ignoring his silk bathrobe, and aggressively booted up his large desktop computer. "I am going to draft a massive stack of emergency counter-injunctions right now," he shouted over the loud hum of the starting machine. "I will personally file an urgent petition for a temporary restraining order against Valerie and Dr. Thorne the absolute second the duty judge is available, but we desperately need heavy immediate artillery to guarantee they are arrested on the spot." He grabbed his mobile phone from the charging dock and rapidly dialed a highly specific, unlisted number. "I have a deeply owed favor to call in with Captain Miller at the Financial Crimes Division," he explained quickly while the phone rang loudly. "He is a high-ranking, incredibly relentless investigator who absolutely despises medical fraud." Richard briefly outlined the massive embezzlement scheme to the sleepy police captain, detailing the $8 million theft and the hidden luxury real estate portfolio owned by Thorne. By the time he hung up the phone 30 minutes later, the grand ambush was perfectly set. Captain Miller was quietly mobilizing a discreet task force to freeze their hidden accounts and prepare immediate felony arrest warrants for massive financial fraud and attempted medical homicide. We were going to strike them with the absolute full force of the law. I left Richard furiously typing legal petitions in his dark office and drove my rattling truck rapidly back through the waking city. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the cold horizon, casting long, pale rays of light across the deserted industrial streets. I pulled into the decaying motel parking lot, my heart aching with a profound, desperate need to see my boy. I quickly unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pushed the creaking door open. Preston was sitting completely upright on the edge of the sagging mattress, gripping the cheap bedsheets with white-knuckled terror. His face was entirely pale, slick with cold sweat, and his breathing was incredibly shallow and rapid. "Dad," he gasped, his voice breaking with absolute, unadulterated fear. "I thought she had found us. I thought you were never coming back." I rushed across the small, dingy room and pulled my grown son into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face against my heavy winter jacket, his shoulders shaking violently, with years of suppressed trauma and immediate panic. I wrapped my arms tightly around his trembling frame, resting my chin gently on the top of his head. For the first time in 10 long, agonizing years, I let a single hot tear slip down my weathered cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but a tear of absolute, unwavering determination. "I am right here, Preston," I whispered fiercely into the quiet, dusty room, holding him closer to my chest. "I will never, ever leave you alone with them again. You are entirely safe now." I pulled back slightly, looking directly into his terrified, exhausted eyes. "You walked today, son," I said, my voice incredibly thick with profound paternal pride and absolute certainty. "You fought through a decade of chemical torture, and you walked. Tomorrow you are going to stand tall and watch them burn." Preston looked at me, a tiny, fragile spark of genuine hope finally breaking through the heavy, suffocating fear in his tired eyes. He slowly nodded his head, his breathing finally beginning to steady in the quiet safety of the hidden room. I reached into my pocket to pull out the prepaid burner phone I had left for him, intending to securely check for any new messages from Richard. Before my fingers could even grasp the smooth plastic, my own personal mobile phone suddenly vibrated violently against my hip. The sharp, unexpected sound made us both flinch. I pulled the device out quickly, my eyes narrowing sharply at the glowing screen. It was Julian Hayes calling from the private chemical laboratory. I answered the phone immediately, my chest tightening with intense anticipation. "Julian, what did you find?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the other end of the secure line. When Julian finally spoke, his usually calm, analytical voice was shaking with absolute, undeniable horror. "Victor," he stammered, breathing heavily into the receiver. "I ran the chemical compounds through the mass spectrometer 3 separate times just to be absolutely certain. This is absolutely not human medication, Victor. The primary active ingredient is a highly regulated, potent synthetic paralytic used exclusively in large veterinary practices. It is a severe neuromuscular blocking agent designed strictly for euthanizing massive livestock. Where on earth did you finally manage to get this?" I stood perfectly still in the quiet hallway of Richard's home, the phone pressed tightly against my ear. Julian's horrified voice echoed loudly through the speaker, shattering the last fragment of my reality. The capsules did not contain any form of human medicine. They contained a severe neuromuscular blocking agent, a potent synthetic chemical designed explicitly to slowly paralyze massive agricultural livestock. Julian explained, his voice shaking with intense professional disgust, that prolonged, repeated exposure to this specific chemical compound would systematically and severely atrophy human muscle tissue, inducing a profound paralysis and a devastating neurological fog. Valerie, the woman I trusted with my entire life, had been actively poisoning our only flesh and blood. She had meticulously administered heavy-grade animal tranquilizers to our son every single night for an entire decade. I thanked Julian in a completely hollow whisper and ended the call. The unadulterated evil of her actions felt like a suffocating weight crushing my chest. I walked back into the formal dining room, where Richard was aggressively analyzing the immense pile of forged documents and financial ledgers I had recovered from the safe. Richard had already summoned his trusted private investigator, a retired federal agent named Marcus, who was sitting quietly at the long mahogany table. Marcus was actively running Valerie's financial history through a classified digital database, searching for any hidden offshore accounts or secret property deeds associated with Thorne. We sat in tense, heavy silence as the morning sun climbed higher. Around noon, Marcus suddenly stopped typing his keyboard. He slowly pushed his heavy wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose and let out a long, very sharp breath. "Victor," he said softly, his voice carrying a dark, ominous tone that immediately sent a fresh wave of ice directly through my veins. "I found something buried very deep inside the archived bank records you pulled from the wall safe. It is not just another luxury real estate purchase or a hidden offshore transfer to the corrupt doctor." Marcus turned his silver laptop around, so Richard and I could clearly see the glowing screen. He pointed directly to a specific heavily encrypted wire transfer originating from Valerie's personal private checking account. The digital timestamp on the official bank document was incredibly specific. The massive payment of exactly $50,000 in cash was permanently processed exactly 10 years ago. I leaned much closer to the bright screen, my tired eyes carefully tracing the stark black text. The exact date of the massive financial transfer was a Tuesday in late August. It was exactly 48 hours before Preston was scheduled to pack his bags and excitedly drive his car across the country to begin his freshman year at Stanford University. It was exactly 2 days before the horrific, catastrophic vehicle crash that supposedly severed his spinal cord and ruined his bright future forever. Who exactly received this money? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous guttural rasp. Marcus brought up the associated routing numbers and the corresponding business license. The recipient was a local, highly shady independent automotive mechanic who operated a failing garage on the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. He abruptly closed his shop and moved out of the state entirely less than 1 week after Preston's tragic accident. The horrifying, monstrous truth finally clicked perfectly into place, illuminating the absolute darkest corner of my wife's black soul. The terrible car crash was absolutely not a tragic random accident. It was a highly calculated, deliberately orchestrated hit. She had meticulously planned to brutally disable him. Valerie had purposefully paid a desperate mechanic to intentionally cut the brake lines on our son's car. She had actively tried to severely maim or completely kill her own child, just to ensure he would never ever leave her house. If Preston had successfully gone to college in California, she would have completely lost her primary legally designated role as his custodial caregiver. She would have lost her immediate, completely unchecked access to the massive $8 million medical trust fund my late brother had generously established for him. Her entire horrific motive was completely rooted in unadulterated psychopathic greed. She had deliberately shattered her own son's spine and then spent the next 10 years actively feeding him livestock tranquilizers, perfectly securing her absolute control over the massive family fortune. My structural engineer mind completely snapped, shifting from profound grief into a state of cold, absolute calculating fury. I was no longer just a betrayed husband or a deeply heartbroken father. I was an intensely focused, highly motivated predator, and I was going to utterly destroy the monsters who had tortured my family. I turned to Richard, my hands clenched into tight, shaking fists. "We are absolutely not going to simply arrest them, Richard. We are going to completely obliterate their entire existence." Richard nodded slowly, a predatory, ruthless smile spreading across his aged face. He immediately began coordinating directly with Captain Miller and his elite task force, perfectly laying the legal and tactical groundwork for the ultimate, inescapable trap. I drove rapidly back to the decaying, neon-lit motel to check on my son. Preston was sitting up in the bed, watching the door with wide, terrified eyes. I sat down directly next to him, placing my hands firmly on his trembling shoulders. I told him everything. I explained the terrifying truth about the animal tranquilizers, the massively depleted trust fund, and the horrifying revelation about the tampered brakes. I watched the last remaining shreds of his childhood innocence completely vanish, instantly replaced by a deep, hardening resolve. I pulled him into a fiercely protective hug. "You bravely walked yesterday, son," I told him, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a solemn promise. Tomorrow, you are going to stand incredibly tall, and you are going to actively watch them burn to the ground. We spent the remainder of the weekend silently preparing, completely fortified in our hidden room, waiting for the perfect moment to execute our flawless ambush against the vile woman who had successfully ruined our entire past. Sunday evening finally arrived, casting long, dark shadows across the cold, sprawling city. I sat completely still on the edge of the cheap motel mattress, staring intently at the glowing face of my mobile phone. The digital clock slowly changed to 6 in the evening. Exactly on schedule, a short text message brightly illuminated the small screen. It was from Valerie. The tone was sickeningly sweet, perfectly maintaining her carefully constructed facade of the devoted, loving wife. Heading home early from Napa Honey. I miss you both so incredibly much. See you in exactly an hour. She was completely unaware that her entire hidden empire of lies had already collapsed, that the police were actively waiting in the shadows, and that her perfect victim had finally become her ultimate executioner. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound, absolute sense of icy calm completely wash over me. My hands were perfectly steady as I typed out my brief, incredibly deliberate reply, ensuring she would walk directly into the center of our waiting trap. We are waiting in the living room for you. I sent the text message and slowly placed my mobile phone face down on the small wooden end table. I looked up at my son. Preston was standing perfectly straight by the massive stone fireplace, completely free from the rusted steel wheelchair that had imprisoned him for an entire decade. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit I had purchased for him just yesterday, his broad shoulders squared, and his chin held remarkably high. The profound physical transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Without the daily influx of the heavy veterinary tranquilizer coursing through his central nervous system, his natural youth and inherent strength had rapidly resurged. The thick, hazy neurological fog had entirely lifted from his bright eyes, replaced by a sharp, burning intensity. We stood together in the absolute suffocating darkness of our expansive living room, waiting in complete silence. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut, plunging the entire lower floor of the massive house into pitch blackness. I sat back down in my favorite leather armchair, resting a warm cup of black coffee on my knee. The agonizing wait felt like an eternity. Finally, the distinct crunching sound of tires rolling slowly onto our long gravel driveway pierced the quiet night. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling my pulse steady into a calm, predatory rhythm. Bright headlights swept briefly across the tightly drawn living room curtains, illuminating the dark fabric, before the heavy engine of a large van idled for a brief moment and shut completely off. I heard the sharp thud of a heavy car door closing, followed immediately by a second, a third, and a fourth. They had arrived exactly as Richard and I had anticipated. Heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed loudly across the concrete walkway leading directly to our front porch. There were far too many footfalls for just Valerie and Dr. Thorne. She had brought exactly what we expected. She had brought hired physical muscle to execute her malicious plan. The distinct metallic jingle of her house keys drifted through the thick oak door. The heavy brass lock clicked sharply, and the massive front door swung open with a slow groan. The cool night air instantly swept into the dark foyer, carrying the faint scent of Valerie's expensive floral perfume. I remained perfectly still in the dark shadows of the living room, gripping the smooth handle of my coffee mug. Beside me, I could hear Preston take a sharp, steadying breath. Valerie stepped cautiously into the unlit hallway. She did not reach for the light switch immediately. Instead, she let out a long sigh, slipping perfectly into her meticulously rehearsed theatrical performance. "Victor," she called out, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated sorrow. "Honey, are you in here? We are so incredibly worried about you." Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor as she took another hesitant step. Her tone was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation, engineered to sound like a terrified, loving wife desperate to save her ailing husband. Please do not be frightened, Victor, she continued, her voice breaking with fake emotion. I brought Dr. Thorne with me. He is right here to help us. Your beautiful mind is slipping, darling. You are terribly confused and you desperately need immediate psychiatric help. We are going to take you to a wonderful place where you can finally rest. The intimidating sounds of thick rubber boots shuffling onto the foyer rug followed her words. Two heavily built men stepped inside behind Dr. Thorne. They were dressed in dark blue uniforms resembling private paramedics, but their aggressive physical presence clearly marked them as hired thugs. They carried heavy canvas restraints and thick leather straps, actively prepared to drag me out of my home, kicking and screaming. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat nervously in the dark. Mr. Vales, he said, his voice attempting to sound authoritative. Please remain calm. We have the official emergency medical orders right here. You are experiencing a severe psychotic break. We need you to come with us peacefully. I did not say a single word. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my warm black coffee. The soft, clinking sound of the ceramic mug touching the glass saucer echoed sharply in the quiet darkness. Valerie gasped lightly, her head snapping directly toward the dark living room. Victor, she whispered, stepping toward the archway. She reached out and slapped the light switch. The massive crystal chandelier suspended high above the ceiling flared brilliantly to life, instantly flooding the room with blinding, radiant light. Valerie stepped fully into the room, a sad, pitying smile firmly plastered across her perfectly made-up face. That fake, sickening smile froze instantly. Her eyes widened into enormous, terrified circles of absolute shock. The expensive designer purse she held tightly in her right hand slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, dull thud. Her jaw went completely slack, her breathing entirely suspended in her throat. She was not looking at me sitting calmly in my leather armchair. She was staring directly past me, looking at the impossible, terrifying phantom, standing tall by the stone fireplace. Preston. He stood perfectly upright, entirely unsupported, staring down at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. His broad shoulders filled out the sharp lines of his new suit, and his strong legs planted him firmly on the floor. There was absolutely no trace of the paralyzed, broken boy she had chemically tortured for 10 years. He looked like a towering monument of undeniable strength and fierce, righteous vengeance. Mother Preston said, his voice deep, completely steady, and vibrating with an icy rage. You look entirely surprised to see me standing. Dr. Thorne stumbled backward into the doorframe, his pale face instantly draining of all color. He let out a pathetic, strangled whimper, his dark eyes darting frantically between Preston's standing form and the empty space where the rusted wheelchair usually sat. The two hired paramedics instinctively took a hesitant step back toward the open front door, their aggressive posture evaporating as they realized this was not the helpless, mentally unstable old man they had been paid to extract. Valerie began to shake violently. Her perfectly manicured facade crumbled into an unrecognizable mask of absolute primal terror. Preston, she stammered, her voice a hollow, pathetic squeak. How? This is impossible. You are paralyzed. I slowly set my coffee mug down on the wooden end table and leaned forward. He is standing because he is no longer ingesting your heavy veterinary tranquilizers, Valerie. I said, my voice carrying the lethal calm of an executioner. We know absolutely everything about your crimes. Valerie let out a horrifying scream of panic. She spun around wildly, desperately trying to escape through the open front door, but her path was instantly blocked. Stepping smoothly out of the dark shadows of the kitchen was Richard Sterling. He was holding a thick stack of legal warrants directly in his hand, a triumphant smile stretching across his face. And stepping into the bright light directly behind him, with their hands resting firmly on their utility belts, were Captain Miller and 3 fully armed uniformed police officers. Valerie stared at the armed police officers, her manicured hands trembling at her sides. The sudden ambush completely knocked the breath out of her lungs. But a master manipulator never surrenders without deploying their final weapon. I watched the calculating gears turning behind her terrified eyes. She took a jagged breath and shifted her physical demeanor. The rigid mask of terror melted away instantly, replaced by a theatrical display of weeping agony. She threw her hands toward her face, letting out a wail that echoed against the high ceiling of our living room. "What are you doing to him?" she screamed loudly, pointing a shaking finger directly at me with a feigned look of horror. "He is completely paralyzed. You are forcefully making him stand against his will. Officers, you have to arrest my husband immediately. He has entirely lost his mind. He is having a psychotic break and actively torturing our disabled son. Please, you have to save my poor boy before his crazy father snaps his spine permanently." She lunged forward desperately, trying to throw her arms around Preston to force him back into his fabricated chemical chains. Captain Miller immediately stepped firmly into her path, his imposing frame acting as an immovable barrier between the frantic woman and my son. He held up a calloused hand, signaling her to halt. Valerie sobbed loudly, pressing her face into her palms, playing the role of the devastated mother with nauseating perfection. She wailed about my rapid dementia, begging Dr. Thorne to corroborate her medical claims to the police. Dr. Thorne, however, was paralyzed by undeniable terror. He remained frozen against the wooden doorframe, his panicked eyes fixed on the thick stack of legal warrants resting comfortably in Richard Sterling's confident hands. The disgraced practitioner knew exactly what those stamped documents represented for his future. His lucrative real estate empire and fabricated medical career were actively burning to ash in front of his sweating face. The two burly men dressed as paramedics quickly realized they had walked into a massive federal trap. They dropped their heavy canvas restraints onto the floor and slowly raised their hands in the air, backing away toward the foyer walls in silent surrender. They were hired muscle, unwilling to go to federal prison for a failing conspiracy. The hysterical noise of Valerie's desperate screaming filled the spacious room, serving as a pathetic attempt to derail the brutal truth. But her frantic performance was abruptly silenced by a single, incredibly calm voice. "Mother, please stop performing right now." The quiet command did not come from me or the captain. It came directly from Preston. His voice was deep, clear, and radiating a profound inner strength that commanded absolute authority in the tense room. Valerie froze instantly. Her theatrical sobbing ceased abruptly, choked off in the back of her throat. She slowly lowered her shaking hands, staring up at the tall, imposing figure of the son she had systematically poisoned for an entire decade. Preston looked down at her, his expression entirely devoid of any residual childhood affection or fear. He looked at her with the cold detachment of a seasoned judge delivering a final verdict. "I have been entirely awake and completely aware for 3 months, Mother," he said smoothly, his steady words slicing cleanly through the suffocating tension of the living room. "I have been silently listening to every single whispered phone call you made from the dark hallway outside my bedroom door. I have heard every cruel complaint you uttered about my slow physical decline. I know absolutely everything about the forced medical conservatorship you planned to file on Monday morning. I know exactly how you ruthlessly drained the private trust fund my Uncle Thomas lovingly left to ensure my survival." Valerie opened her mouth to speak, but no words materialized. Her beautiful face drained of all color, leaving her smooth skin a sickening shade of grayish white. She looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. She desperately looked over her shoulder toward Dr. Thorne for any sliver of salvation, but the disgraced physician was already slowly raising his shaking hands in a pathetic gesture of ultimate surrender to the heavily armed police officers moving in behind him. I stood up slowly from my leather armchair, carefully smoothing the front of my dark jacket. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of the raging fury storming deep inside my tight chest. I moved with cold, deliberate surgical precision. I reached into my thick leather satchel and pulled out the massive stack of documented evidence Richard and I had painstakingly assembled throughout the sleepless night. I walked calmly toward the center of the room and tossed the heavy papers directly onto the pristine glass coffee table. The printed documents landed with a sharp smack that echoed loudly through the brilliantly lit living room. I carefully spread the undeniable proof across the smooth glass surface for everyone to clearly witness. These are the highly encrypted offshore bank statements. Valerie Foy stated calmly, my voice carrying the lethal weight of an inescapable conclusion. They detail every single illicit wire transfer you personally authorized, methodically bleeding my brother's generous $8 million trust fund completely dry month after month. Next to those financial ledgers are the certified public property deeds, confirming Dr. Thorne's hidden luxury real estate portfolio purchased exclusively with the stolen funds meant to secure my son's lifelong medical care. And right here I tapped a thick manila folder repeatedly with my index finger. Are the forged psychiatric evaluations you maliciously designed to strip away my mental competency, lock me in a ward, and totally steal my remaining estate? I paused for a long moment, deliberately letting the devastating reality of their total destruction settle heavily onto their shrinking shoulders. Captain Miller silently signaled to his uniformed officers who slowly stepped forward, producing heavy steel handcuffs from their dark utility belts. Valerie began to hyperventilate loudly, taking short, ragged breaths as her entire luxurious world collapsed into absolute ruin. She staggered backward, her expensive high heels catching on the thick Persian rug. But I was not completely finished. The most horrifying revelation was still hidden in my pocket. I reached deep into the inner lining of my winter jacket and slowly pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of thick white paper. It was the official chemical analysis provided directly by Julian Hayes at the highly secure private laboratory. I held it up firmly in the bright light of the crystal chandelier, making absolutely certain that Valerie and Dr. Thorne could clearly see the stark black ink of the indisputable scientific results. And this right here, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous whisper that instantly commanded terrified silence from every single person standing in the room, is the official expedited toxicology report. It proves beyond any shadow of a legal or moral doubt exactly what you have been doing in the dark. This is the heavy-grade veterinary tranquilizer, the severe muscular atrophying agent that you have been purposefully and systematically feeding him for 3,600 days. The heavy silence that followed my devastating revelation was completely absolute, hanging in the bright living room like a thick, suffocating cloud of toxic gas. Dr. Aris Thorne stared at the printed chemical analysis in my hand, his dark eyes bulging with absolute primal panic. The calculated, arrogant medical professional was entirely gone, instantly replaced by a cornered, desperate criminal facing the utter destruction of his entire life. With a sudden guttural shout, Thorne violently shoved his heavy leather briefcase directly at the nearest police officer and bolted blindly toward the open front door. He did not make it very far. Captain Miller reacted with the blinding speed of a seasoned law enforcement veteran. He stepped swiftly into the hallway, wrapping his thick, muscular arms directly around Thorne's waist and driving him aggressively into the polished hardwood floor. The heavy impact rattled the expensive crystal chandelier hanging brightly above us. Two other uniformed officers instantly swarmed the disgraced physician, pinning his struggling limbs firmly to the ground and forcefully clicking heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his pale wrists. The two burly men dressed as private paramedics, completely realizing the terrifying, massive scope of the federal trap they had foolishly walked directly into, slowly and silently backed out of the wide front door with their hands raised highly in the air, offering absolutely no physical resistance, as the remaining officers quickly escorted them directly to the waiting, flashing patrol cars. Valerie watched her entire wicked, meticulously constructed empire collapse into total, irreversible ruin in a matter of agonizing seconds. The undeniable physical proof of her decade-long chemical torture rested brightly on the glass table, and her primary accomplice was currently groveling pathetically on the floor in heavy steel chains. She slowly sank to her knees right in the exact center of the plush Persian rug. The expensive fabric of her designer dress pooled elegantly around her as she desperately attempted to deploy the absolute last psychological weapon she had left in her manipulative arsenal. She began to weep loudly, forcing heavy fabricated tears to stream rapidly down her pale, perfectly contoured cheeks. She looked desperately up at me and then directly at Preston, her voice shaking with a masterful, deeply sickening display of pure maternal agony. "I did it for us," she wailed loudly, clutching her trembling hands tightly against her chest, as if she were the ultimate tragic victim of a profound, devastating misunderstanding. "You have to simply believe me, Victor. I only wanted to lovingly keep our beautiful family safely together under one roof." He was going to pack his bags, drive away to a massive college in California, and completely forget about me forever. He was going to heartlessly leave me all alone in this massive, incredibly empty house. I could not bear the terrible, suffocating thought of permanently losing my precious baby boy. I did exactly what any loving, incredibly desperate mother would do to protect her fragile family from entirely falling apart. I just wanted to keep him perfectly safe and closely bonded to my heart forever. I stood perfectly still, looking coldly down at the weeping woman I had faithfully loved and blindly trusted for so many incredibly long years. There was absolutely no trace of human compassion left anywhere inside my cold, thoroughly methodical heart. I did not raise my voice in sudden anger, and I did not let my righteous, burning fury break my surgical, highly calculating composure for even a single microsecond. Instead, I walked slowly and deliberately around the edge of the glass coffee table and stopped directly in front of her weeping, kneeling form. With cold surgical precision, I pulled a thick stack of documents from my jacket and tossed the damning evidence directly onto the smooth glass. "Here are your highly encrypted offshore bank statements, the certified luxury property deeds strictly registered in Thorne's personal name, and your fully forged psychiatric conservatorship papers. But that is absolutely not all." I reached back into my pocket and slowly pulled out the single most horrifying physical document. Richard Sterling and his highly trained private investigator had successfully unearthed from the darkest depths of your highly encrypted financial history. It was a faded 10-year-old banking record attached directly to a crude handwritten invoice from a shady independent automotive garage located on the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. I tossed the damning piece of paper right at her tear-stained, highly deceptive face. The thin document fluttered briefly in the tense air before landing silently on the thick rug directly between her trembling knees. Valerie stared blankly down at the faded ink, her fabricated sobbing stopping completely, instantly replaced by a sudden, terrifying inability to physically draw basic oxygen into her tightening lungs. "That is the exact billing invoice from the desperate failing mechanic you secretly paid exactly 10 years ago," I stated smoothly, my deep voice echoing with lethal, unforgiving clarity. "The specific offshore bank transfer of exactly $50,000 in untraceable cash was completely processed exactly 2 days before our son was scheduled to safely drive his car to Stanford. You did not just want to keep him close to home, Valerie. You wanted absolute, total, completely unchecked control over the massive $8 million medical trust fund my late brother Thomas had generously established for his beloved, talented nephew. You knew perfectly well that if Preston left this house as a completely healthy, independent college student, your primary legally designated role as his custodial caregiver would instantly evaporate into thin air. Your highly expensive luxury lifestyle, your endless designer shopping sprees, and your lavish downtown hotel stays would instantly vanish. You would completely lose your immediate, highly lucrative access to that massive family fortune forever. So you actively orchestrated a horrific, devastating, entirely deliberate tragedy. You actively paid a corrupt, desperate mechanic to deliberately and maliciously cut the sensitive brake lines on Preston's heavy vehicle. You purposely caused that catastrophic, life-altering crash on that rainy afternoon. You intentionally broke your own son's spinal cord just so you could violently and ruthlessly steal his $8 million. You completely destroyed his entire bright future without feeling a single ounce of human remorse. And then you comfortably spent 3,600 days actively feeding him heavy, highly regulated veterinary tranquilizers to brutally ensure he never, ever walked again. The brilliant, affluent living room went completely terrifyingly dead silent. The undeniable, absolute reality of your extreme, entirely sociopathic greed finally settled heavily upon every single person present. Even the highly seasoned, deeply hardened police officers standing alert guard in the shadowy foyer looked visibly sickened, their stern faces twisting in profound, undeniable disgust at the shivering, kneeling woman. Valerie did not attempt to loudly deny the horrific, incredibly monstrous truth I had just thoroughly exposed. She slowly dragged her wide eyes away from the damning mechanic invoice and looked desperately up at the towering, powerful figure standing firmly by the tall stone fireplace. She slowly reached out her trembling, perfectly manicured hand toward him, her failing voice cracking into a pathetic, hopelessly desperate sob. "Preston, my sweet baby, please listen to me right now." Preston looked down at the woman who had stolen his youth. He did not flinch, nor did he offer even a fraction of a sympathetic gaze toward her trembling, outstretched hand. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step backward, pulling his impeccably tailored suit jacket away from her grasping fingers, as if her physical touch were a highly toxic, corrosive acid. He stood perfectly tall, a towering monument of reclaimed strength and unyielding defiance. His face remained entirely composed, a mask of absolute chilling indifference that perfectly mirrored the cold, sociopathic detachment she had shown him every single day for the past 3,600 days. Valerie looked up at him with wide, desperately pleading eyes, her makeup completely ruined by her heavy, fabricated tears. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another web of elaborate, sickening lies, but the crushing silence of the living room was instantly shattered by the deep, steady resonance of the voice of my son. "You are not my mother," Preston stated, his tone incredibly, even devoid of any residual childhood affection or lingering emotional attachment. "You are my warden. You are a monster who purposefully orchestrated a horrific tragedy and then happily watched me suffer in a rusted metal cage while you actively drained my future to fund your extravagant, selfish lifestyle. I have spent 10 long, agonizing years locked inside a chemical prison entirely of your making, fully aware of my surroundings, but completely unable to break free from your sickening grip." He paused, letting his heavy absolute condemnation hang in the cold air before turning his gaze directly toward the waiting officers. "Take her away." The firm, authoritative command from the very victim of her monstrous crimes signaled the immediate end of the elaborate theatrical performance. Captain Miller nodded sharply to the two uniformed officers standing rigidly by the archway. They moved forward with swift, uncompromising efficiency, their heavy boots thudding loudly against the Persian rug. One officer securely grasped her right arm, pulling her forcefully upward from her kneeling position, while the other quickly seized her left wrist, twisting it firmly behind her back. The sharp, highly distinct metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs, closing tightly around her pale wrists, echoed through the expansive living room, marking the absolute finality of her reign of terror. "You have the right to remain entirely silent," the taller officer recited calmly, his voice a steady, rhythmic drone that completely overpowered her sudden, frantic wails. "Anything you say can and absolutely will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights were formally read, the mask of refined elegance and affluent superiority shattered into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. She began to thrash violently against the unyielding grip of the seasoned officers, her expensive designer dress twisting and tearing as she kicked wildly at the empty air. She screamed at the top of her lungs, a harsh, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated fury and absolute desperate denial. She cursed my name, she cursed Dr. Thorne for his cowardly surrender, and she screamed vile, vicious insults at the son she had just seconds ago called her sweet baby. She fought with the rabid, chaotic energy of a cornered predator, realizing that there was absolutely no escape from the devastating consequences of her actions. The officers did not hesitate or falter. They dragged her kicking and screaming directly across the polished hardwood floor, pulling her forcefully out of the beautiful, massive home she had so ruthlessly tried to steal. I stood quietly beside my son, watching with cold, methodical satisfaction as the violent struggle moved rapidly through the long foyer and out the heavy oak front door. Richard Sterling stepped forward, offering a curt, highly professional nod of approval, before turning to follow Captain Miller out into the crisp night air, eager to ensure the booking process went exactly as meticulously planned. The heavy wooden door closed firmly behind them, shutting out the chaotic, frantic noise of the sudden arrests. I slowly walked toward the massive bay windows, pulling the heavy velvet curtains slightly aside to peer out into the darkness. The bright flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the manicured lawns and the neighboring houses in a chaotic spinning rhythm of brilliant color. I watched silently as they forced Valerie into the back of a secure patrol car, her screaming face pressed angrily against the thick, reinforced glass. Dr. Thorne was already sitting defeated in a separate vehicle, his head bowed heavily in absolute miserable surrender. Within minutes, the powerful engines roared to life, and the long procession of law enforcement vehicles slowly pulled out of my wide gravel driveway. The spinning lights gradually faded into the distant, quiet night, leaving behind an incredibly profound, heavy silence. The massive, cavernous house, once a stifling prison of deception and chemical torture, suddenly felt remarkably still, entirely purged of the suffocating, toxic presence that had haunted its halls for an entire decade. I turned away from the dark window and looked back into the brightly lit living room. Preston and I stood entirely alone in the quiet space, the heavy, lingering adrenaline slowly beginning to recede from our tired veins. My eyes drifted slowly toward the far corner of the room, landing directly on the rusted, heavy steel wheelchair that had served as the physical symbol of her profound evil. It sat completely empty in the shadows, a vile metallic throne of deceit that had kept my vibrant, intelligent son bound to a tragic, fabricated narrative. I stared at the worn leather armrests and the dull, scuffed wheels, feeling a sudden, immense surge of righteous, purifying anger rising from the absolute depths of my weary soul. I did not say a single word to Preston. I turned and walked with deliberate, heavy strides down the quiet hallway, pulling open the side door that led directly into the garage. I bypassed my gleaming toolboxes and reached straight for a massive, solid steel sledgehammer resting heavily on the wooden workbench. I gripped the thick, textured handle firmly in my right hand, feeling the cold, reassuring weight of the dense metal. I walked slowly back into the living room, my eyes fixed entirely on the empty chair. I raised the heavy sledgehammer high above my shoulder and brought it down with devastating explosive force directly onto the center of the metal frame. The loud, violent crash of shattering steel and snapping plastic echoed like a booming gunshot across the entirely empty, silent walls of the expansive home. I swung the heavy sledgehammer again and again, repeatedly smashing the delicate spokes of the wheels, entirely obliterating the padded seat and violently reducing the hated instrument of our long-suffering into a twisted, completely jagged pile of entirely unrecognizable metal debris. I finally stepped backward and dropped the heavy hammer directly onto the ruined, shattered metal, feeling a massive, incredible weight finally lift from my aging shoulders. "It is over," I said, looking down and breathing incredibly heavily into the quiet room. Preston stepped forward and smiled genuinely for the very first time in a decade. "No, Dad. It is just beginning." Preston was absolutely right. The destruction of that rusted metal wheelchair was not the conclusion of our long journey. It was the loud, echoing starting gun of a ruthless, systematic campaign for absolute justice. The following weeks moved with blinding speed, a whirlwind of federal indictments, courtroom battles, and undeniable vindication. Valerie and Dr. Thorne were immediately stripped of their lavish lifestyles and thrust into the cold, unforgiving reality of the criminal justice system. The massive pile of undeniable evidence Richard and I had meticulously gathered proved completely insurmountable. They faced a mountain of severe federal charges, including conspiracy to commit attempted murder, massive medical fraud, and grand embezzlement. I sat quietly in the front row of the crowded courtroom, watching with a stone-cold expression as the arrogant physician and my deceptive former wife were repeatedly forced to face their monstrous crimes. Valerie tried to play the victim one final time, sobbing loudly for the weary judge, but the chilling toxicology reports and the undeniable mechanic invoice silenced any potential sympathy. The judge looked down from his high bench with profound disgust and delivered a merciless, ironclad verdict. Valerie and Dr. Thorne were both sentenced to serve 25 years in federal prison without any possibility of parole. They were led away in heavy chains, completely stripped of their dignity, while Preston and I walked out of the courthouse as entirely free men. With the criminal architects of our misery securely locked away behind thick steel bars, I immediately turned my intense focus toward the complex financial battlefield. Richard Sterling proved to be an absolute shark in the corporate legal arena. Together, we aggressively sued the massive international bank that had blindly facilitated Valerie's illicit, highly encrypted offshore transfers for an entire decade. We relentlessly exposed their severe institutional negligence and gross failure to properly monitor my late brother's designated medical trust fund. Faced with a massive public relations disaster and our overwhelming stack of forensic evidence, the terrified banking executives quickly settled out of court for an astronomical sum. We successfully recovered every single stolen dollar, entirely replenishing the massive $8 million trust. I did not stop there. I legally petitioned the court to dissolve the toxic, restrictive conservatorship that Valerie had weaponized for so long. Once the presiding judge reviewed Preston's miraculous cognitive recovery and clean medical evaluations, he granted our request without a single moment of hesitation. I marched directly into Richard's downtown office the very next morning and officially signed a towering stack of legal documents. I permanently transferred every single recovered asset, every property deed, and the entirety of the massive trust fund directly into Preston's name. The money was finally exactly where my generous brother Thomas had originally intended it to be, completely safe from any future manipulation or greedy hands. Securing our financial future was a massive victory, but the true grueling battle lay completely outside the sterile walls of any courtroom or bank. Preston had spent a decade trapped in a horrific chemical paralysis, and his body required a monumental, agonizing effort to fully rebuild its lost strength. We immediately enrolled him in an elite intensive physical therapy program designed for extreme recovery. The daily rehabilitation sessions were incredibly brutal, pushing him far beyond any normal human limits. I stood by his side every single morning in the bright, echoing gymnasium, watching him push his recovering muscles to the absolute breaking point. There were days of intense, blinding pain moments where his trembling legs simply gave out, and he collapsed heavily onto the thick blue mats, his face soaked in hot sweat and frustrated tears. His lungs would burn as he gasped for air, his hands gripping the metal rails of the parallel walking bars until his knuckles turned completely white. But I was always right there to catch him. I spotted his heavy lifts, I held his shaking shoulders during the agonizing balancing exercises, and I constantly cheered him on when the sheer physical exhaustion threatened to completely break his spirit. "You are doing perfectly, son," I would tell him, wiping a cool towel across his forehead. "You are building armor they can never ever pierce again." With each passing week, the incredible transformation accelerated. His previously atrophied muscles swelled with fresh, vibrant power. His tentative, shaky steps evolved into a confident, commanding stride. The lingering shadows of his stolen youth completely melted away, replaced by the hardened, magnificent physique of a young man who had walked directly through hell and emerged completely unbroken. Our bond, once fractured by Valerie's toxic lies, grew stronger than tempered steel through the shared crucible of his magnificent, triumphant recovery. He pushed through every physical barrier, determined to reclaim every single moment that had been viciously stolen from his grasp. The long months of winter slowly gave way to a bright, promising spring, and the suffocating darkness that had plagued our massive home for so long was finally replaced by genuine warmth and unadulterated hope. We spent our quiet evenings sitting together on the back porch, watching the sun set over the sprawling property, talking openly about the boundless future that now stretched endlessly before him. Preston spoke passionately about his long-delayed dreams, his voice carrying the heavy, profound wisdom of a survivor and the vibrant, electric ambition of a man completely reborn. He had spent 10 years trapped inside a silent prison, watching the world move forward without him, but he refused to let the heavy weight of that lost time anchor his soul. Instead, he channeled that immense fiery energy into an unstoppable drive for absolute excellence. He spent his late nights poring over thick, heavy textbooks and complex blueprints, sharply reigniting the brilliant, structural mind he had always possessed before the horrific crash. I watched him study with an incredible, overwhelming sense of paternal pride, completely marveling at his sheer, unbreakable resilience. The vicious, calculated poison that Valerie had used to suppress his bright mind had ultimately failed to extinguish his inner light. He was not just surviving his profound trauma. He was actively thriving, meticulously, charting a bold, magnificent course for a life that was finally entirely his own. The deep, agonizing scars of our shared past were permanently etched into our memories, but they no longer dictated our daily existence. We had successfully conquered the very monsters who had tried to bury us alive, and we had emerged from the ashes stronger, wiser, and completely united. Exactly 6 months after that fateful, dramatic night, the crisp, energetic winds of a vibrant morning swept briskly across the sprawling city. I slid confidently behind the steering wheel of my beautifully restored classic vintage Ford truck, the deep rumble of the heavy engine vibrating warmly through my chest. The bright sun reflected brilliantly off the polished chrome bumper as I navigated the busy, bustling streets with a profound sense of absolute peace. I turned smoothly onto a wide avenue and parked directly in front of a prestigious architectural firm in downtown Chicago. The beautiful, promising new chapter of our lives had finally officially begun today, and I absolutely could not wait to see what my brilliant son would build next. I shifted the heavy manual gear selector firmly into park and gently killed the humming engine of the truck. The chaotic, suffocating weight that had relentlessly crushed my tired shoulders for an entire decade was completely gone. I felt incredibly relaxed, genuinely happy, and profoundly at peace for the very first time in what felt like a lifetime. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my door, and stepped out onto the bustling Chicago pavement. The cool morning breeze swept past us as I walked around the front grille of the vintage vehicle and opened the heavy passenger door for my son. Preston stepped out into the bright city sunlight. He moved with a careful, deliberate grace that commanded absolute respect. He carried a slight, lingering limp in his right leg, a permanent physical reminder of the horrific trauma he had bravely survived, but he did not let it hinder his forward momentum at all. He leaned heavily on a sleek, polished wooden walking cane, gripping the smooth silver handle with absolute confidence. Despite the subtle unevenness in his stride, he stood incredibly tall, projecting an aura of undeniable strength and fierce determination. He paused on the concrete sidewalk, taking a long moment to carefully adjust the dark silk tie resting against his crisp white collar. He slowly tilted his head backward, looking directly up at the towering, magnificent glass and steel skyscraper looming high above us. This was a highly prestigious, globally recognized architectural firm, and they had actively recruited him based entirely on his undeniable merit and his brilliant portfolio. Today was his first official day working as a junior architect. He was finally boldly reclaiming the bright, beautiful life that had been so viciously and violently stolen from him when he was just 18 years old. I stood silently beside him, watching the bright reflections of the passing cars dance across the mirrored surface of the towering building. I felt a massive, overwhelming surge of pure parental pride swell deep inside my chest. He had fought through absolute hell, enduring years of dark chemical imprisonment, only to emerge as a remarkably focused, highly capable young professional, ready to conquer the entire world. The journey to this exact moment had tested every single fiber of our shared humanity, pushing us through an exhausting labyrinth of relentless legal battles and punishing physical rehabilitation sessions. But seeing him standing here now, completely independent and full of unbridled ambition, made every single second of our agonizing struggle entirely worthwhile. He had spent countless grueling hours pushing his physical limits inside the sterile rehabilitation center, enduring immense physical agony, just to be able to stand proudly on this very sidewalk today. The vile woman, who had secretly poisoned his body and stolen his youth, was now securely locked inside a federal penitentiary, serving out her long, miserable sentence without any possibility of early release. Her twisted, greedy accomplice was suffering the exact same lonely fate, entirely stripped of his illicit medical license and his vast, fraudulently acquired wealth. We had systematically dismantled their entire criminal operation, completely recovering the stolen trust fund and legally returning every single asset to its rightful owner. Preston was no longer a helpless victim trapped inside a rusted metal wheelchair. He was a triumphant, entirely independent survivor, actively ready to finally conquer his chosen professional field. We did not need to exchange any grand emotional speeches or shed any heavy tears on that busy sidewalk. We simply turned toward each other and shared a brief, incredibly powerful hug. It was a quiet, profound understanding between two men who had faced the darkest, most evil corners of human nature and survived the brutal ordeal entirely together. He pulled away, offering me a small, confident smile that radiated pure hope and deep gratitude. I clapped him firmly on his broad shoulder one last time. He turned away from the truck, gripping his sleek walking cane, and walked with steady, unyielding purpose directly toward the massive revolving glass doors of the busy lobby. I stayed by the truck, leaning comfortably against the cool metal fender, watching his tall figure completely disappear into the bustling crowd of corporate professionals. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and took a long, incredibly deep breath of the crisp, clean Chicago air. The dark, terrifying shadows of our painful past were permanently behind us, completely replaced by the bright, boundless horizon of a perfectly reclaimed future. The absolute justice we had relentlessly fought for was finally served, and the unbroken legacy of our family was now safely secured in the capable, talented hands of my remarkable son. I opened my eyes, feeling completely ready to embrace whatever peaceful, quiet days awaited me next, knowing with absolute certainty that the terrible nightmare was finally completely over. The most dangerous enemies are rarely the strangers hiding in dark alleys. Sometimes they are the ones sleeping beside us, cloaked in the illusion of love and care. True evil manipulates our deepest trust, turning our sacrifices into weapons against us. But no lie, no matter how perfectly constructed or how long it is maintained, can withstand the relentless light of the truth. When you sense that something is wrong with the people you love, never ignore your gut feeling. An honest intuition is a highly powerful shield, and taking decisive action is the only way to protect your family. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling life stories. What would you have done in his shoes? Let me know in the comments below, and please tell me where you are watching from today. Stay safe, everyone.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pine. times. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.